Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Zeynep Gökçe. International diplomacy is converging on the Ukraine war from all directions. After a sweep through Europe, President Vlodymyr Zelenskyy landed in Ankara on Wednesday. It's part of Türkiye's push to revive the Istanbul Process, a framework both Kiev and Moscow once backed. But Russia sent no delegation, a stark reminder of the mistrust still lingering after more than 3 years of war. At the same time, US officials waited in Kiev with a new peace proposal. The plan has reportedly been reviewed and backed by Zelenskyy. But in Brussels, EU leaders fear it will sideline European countries and force concessions to Moscow. Since the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska last August, progress has been minimal as Ukraine saw continued drone and missile strikes. Reports now suggest any deal could involve painful terms for Kiev, including territorial concessions and limits on its military. Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan calls this one of the war's darkest moments, with both armies in a deadlock. Can a breakthrough be reached in coming days or weeks? For more, joining me now from Ankara is former Turkish diplomat Gülru Gezer. From Minsk, founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, Yevgeny Pryaman, and from Washington, D.C., senior advisor at Global Policy Institute, Sean Michael Cox. Thank you all for joining me. Now, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy just paid a visit to Ankara to meet Turkish President Erdogan. Gülru, what were the key takeaways of this meeting, and why did the two leaders emphasize the need to revive the Istanbul peace process?
Well, we understand now that the U.S. has been working on a peace plan for some time. And both sides of the conflict have been engaged. And, Foreign Minister Fidan was in Washington, and I think that he was also informed about the plan. So maybe there was a decision made for Zelenskyy to visit Ankara before Zelenskyy. Rustem Umerov was also in Turkey. He held talks with Foreign Minister Fidan as well. So Zelenskyy came and spoke with the president, and I think that there was a joint decision to revive the talks within the framework of all the talks that were going on prior to this summit. The main takeaways, we can say that the two sides decided that they would revive the Istanbul talks that, that took place lastly during last spring. There were 3 rounds of talks. Certain steps were taken within the framework of those talks, but then, there was a disruption. I think other factors, domestic factors, the corruption scandal in Ukraine, and the war, the intensification of the war, all led to the decision of Ukraine to revive these talks. And Turkey has been an honest broker. So to come back to your question, the main takeaways were that to start the talks, President Erdogan's emphasis on the fact that the international community should also support these talks was, I think, a reference to the 2022 talks that ended, that had started just after the conflict broke out. I think it is important to support these talks because we are, I think, at a turning point. And when we couple it with the Trump peace plan, I think we can finally have a breakthrough in these talks. So I think it was an important visit and a very timely visit.
Yes, and on the battlefield, there's been a shift towards long-range missile strikes and drone warfare. Yevgeny, Russia has been hinting that it could revive nuclear weapons tests, and so has the US. So how far could this escalation go?
Well, unfortunately, I think that the escalation can go pretty far and to pretty dangerous waters unless there is an intensified and substantive and meaningful diplomatic engagement. Unfortunately, we've seen over the last several years since the major conflict broke out in 2022 that once attempts to achieve some kind of negotiated solution fail, there is always an escalation that follows. And as we unfortunately know, escalations can take different forms. They can be, as we call them, vertical, meaning that behavior weaponry is used and it causes heavier damage to basically both sides, but primarily, of course, to Ukraine. But it can also take a horizontal escalation, meaning that it can broaden itself, the conflict, geographically, and it can even include other countries. Over the last several months, unfortunately, we've seen indications that this is growing more and more realistic. Thanks God, there haven't been direct clashes involving other countries, NATO countries, for example, but we've seen all sorts of escalatory developments below the threshold of a direct confrontation, direct conflict. But all those can very quickly, unfortunately, escalate to a major crisis. Therefore, we need to realize that the risks and dangers of such a scenario are real. And it only doubles down on the conclusion, and I here agree with the ambassador, that we all need to support the strengthened diplomatic process, including within the Istanbul framework.
Yes, this 28-point US plan is underway to end the war. Sean, what do we know so far? Is this just a rebranded attempt to push Kiev to give up its territory? Is there a realistic pathway that could satisfy both sides?
Well, the plan itself, in reading the details, I've got to say I was shocked that the U.S. side even floated this. As one EU delegate stated yesterday, it's like Groundhog Day, citing the well-known movie, that is essentially a rehash of many of the plans that points that have been put in plans since the Russian invasion in 2022. And many of the points of this 28-point plan have been soundly and roundly objected to by both Ukraine and by European supporters of Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that unless Ukraine is in a very, very desperate situation at this point in time, I don't see any way that they could even seriously consider this. Even the United States itself, after the plan leaked out, said this is not really a plan that we're expecting to have it signed off on. It's more of a framework of a plan to still be negotiated. Many of the points, for example, de facto recognition of Russian control of Crimea, de facto recognition of Russian control of Luhansk and Donetsk, freezing the lines of contact and essentially ceding what is something 20 to 25% of Ukrainian territory to Russia in exchange for setting up a demilitarized zone and Russian promises that they will not occupy the military zone. It's ridiculous, this concept of this plan, and it seems that the United States is just trying to notch a win for them, so that President Trump can say, "Oh, I resolved another war. I brought peace to this long-lasting conflict." But the fundamentals of this plan are frankly ridiculous.
Yes, as Sean said, European leaders have voiced their concerns about being sidelined. So, Gülru, why is European participation essential in shaping any diplomatic framework? And what could be the consequences when initiatives are perceived as US-driven rather than a collective effort?
Well, the importance of having Europe or the European Union on board in a potential peace or peace plan is because the war is in Europe. And the European countries have supplied most of Ukraine's weapons from the onset of the war. And they also have differing, of course, threat perceptions. So they want to know what's going on. They want to be a part of the process, because we've seen throughout the past nearly 4 years, we've also seen several intelligence reports claiming that Russia will not stop in Ukraine and will, Russia has other aspirations towards other European countries. So when we're talking about Trump and the Trump administration, they fear that and we see it in the peace plan. And I completely agree with our American colleague that I was also quite surprised because it includes very, very painful concessions for Ukraine. And I don't know who would sign up to that. I mean, it's really, it came as a shock to me as well. But so Europeans are afraid that the result might end up with an even more destabilized Ukraine and destabilized Europe. So they want to be a part of it. They want to make sure that the plan or the peace will be sustainable and it will be fair for both sides.
Yes, and Hungary's foreign minister has pointed out that Europe is spending too much money on Ukraine in reference to the corruption probe that's going on in the country. So, Yohani, how much could such allegations weaken Ukraine, and could it impact its military on the battlefield?
I think they are already weakening Ukraine. And I think when we follow the developments in terms of the internal discussion in Ukraine, but also all the other questions which have been raised currently by Ukraine's allies in Europe, but also in the United States, we can also tell quite clearly that this is a huge blow. Generally speaking, the domestic arena, domestic politics in Ukraine have been, well, frozen for the last several years since the outbreak of the major war. And that has helped, of course, the Ukrainian effort in terms of unifying its own defense and keeping its act together. But it was only a matter of time that the domestic politics was to return. I mean, if we know a thing or two about Ukrainian politics, this is always the case there. And the very fact that it is returning through this corruption crisis, I think, is going to be a major blow to stability inside Ukraine and also to how the country could continue this fighting effort as a unified actor. I don't expect major disruptions in terms of how Ukraine is functioning tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But there is no doubt that this is going to set a new trend inside Ukraine, which will have multiple impacts on the ability of the country to conduct the war, and which will literally undermine its ability to continue defending itself the way which has been the case so far.
And meanwhile, the US has also imposed sanctions on Russia on its energy sector. So, Sean, if Washington's peace plan doesn't hold, what leverage does it have left on Russia? And what should its next strategies be to corner Russia, whether it's diplomatically or economically?
The issue of leverage against Russia is a very interesting one with the Trump administration, both because of the actions that the Trump administration took during Donald Trump's first presidency and the inconsistencies that we have seen from the Trump administration in his second term as well. The United States has abandoned a leadership role in the world under both Trump terms, and the outreach that we should have been making to our allies to support global sanctions against Russia has been severely weakened. Yes, the United States still has leverage. The sanctions that were recently imposed on Rosneft and Lukoil are potentially significant. The United States is still controlling the dominant financial network in the world. But Russia, for example, over the past 4 years has diversified its sources, so they're not so reliant on what's known as dollar clearing anymore. But still, 50% of their transactions are done in markets where the dollar dominates. While they've moved to yuan and ruble transactions, they still have to, clear dollars for freight, for insurance, for trade loans, and the like. And so it's an interesting conflict between the two, that we as the United States have control of the financial system. Russia's working to move away from the financial system, but it's being very challenging. What needs to happen is that the United States has to make these sanctions stick. They have to take steps to demonstrate that sanctions are being effective, for example, by publishing monthly statistics on how effective they are. We need to stop undermining our own policies. You know, the Trump administration imposed these sanctions on Russia, but then on that very same day, they gave relief to several other countries that were in similar positions. And so that negative dichotomy impacts how these sanctions are perceived against the United States. And we also have to close the India and China loophole. We have to assert our authority, if I can use that term, over India, and we have to pursue relations with China that will convince them to stop doing business with Russia. We really have to tighten the screws on Russia, otherwise any kind of sanctions will not work.
I want to talk a bit about the global South countries, because many of them have a neutral stance when it comes to this conflict. Gülru, how influential could these states be in shaping a roadmap to end the conflict, and what kind of leverage do they have over Russia?
Frankly, we can't really talk about a unified stance vis-a-vis the global South, because we are talking about China, we're talking about India. Some of the African countries have special relations with Russia, so they have a different stance. Some of the Latin American countries have a special relationship with Russia, so they have a different stance. So we can't really talk about a unified front vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. But there have been initiatives in the past. We know that, for example, the president of South Africa, he floated a, I think, 10-point plan, a peace plan, which really didn't, come into fruition. But I think from the onset of the war, Russia wanted, as a counterpart, the U.S. It wanted to engage in dialogue with the U.S. That didn't happen during the Biden administration. But when Trump was reelected, he engaged in dialogue with Russia. Well, nothing really substantial, as far as we know, of course, nothing really substantial came out of the summit in Alaska. But the global South, some of them did support certain initiatives, but really, when we're talking about finding a solution to the war in Ukraine, I think the main actors here are the U.S., Europe, and of course countries like Türkiye that have, from the onset of the war, really put an extra effort in trying to find a common ground for the war to end.
Yes, and the EU is working to strengthen its defense capabilities. But in the context of the Ukraine war, Yevgeny, how much does this shape Europe's decision-making? And does it influence the timeline Europe prefers for the war's outcome?
Definitely, I would say there is a connection, and it's very difficult to ignore that connection between the decisions being made within the European Union and the developments on the Russian-Ukrainian battlefield. At the same time, somewhat ironically, I think the major factor driving those decisions in terms of militarization and rearmaments within the European Union is not so much the war, but rather the changes in Washington, in the White House. Even if we'll look at the developments and decisions made this year, we can clearly relate those decisions by the European Union to the fact that Donald Trump returned to the White House and returned to the political agenda vis-a-vis the Europeans and NATO allies, which he is always known for. So we remember a lot of European politicians last year, for example, in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections, making this point that the EU and European part of NATO needs to be Trump-proofed. But I think, in fact, nothing was done until the moment that Trump re-entered the White House. And now we're seeing all those decisions, sometimes chaotic, in my view, by the European Commission and certain member states within the European Union, which are all about trying to restore some kind of strategic autonomy for Europe. And that autonomy needs to rely, in their view, on a modernized military and military-industrial complex. Of course, how easy it is going to be for the European Union to implement all those ideas which are being declared, and some of those ideas are now parts of programs and blueprints and all sorts of papers which have been circulated. So it still remains to be seen how it is going to be, because I think the fundamental structural dependence of the majority of the European Union member states on the American security umbrella is so huge and it's so difficult to overcome, even with billions of euros being inserted in the industrial complex.
Yes, and there are also reports of Türkiye and UAE mediating for a prisoner exchange between Ukraine and Russia. And also Washington is having its own talks with Moscow for its own prisoner exchange. So, Sean, could these parallel efforts open the door for real peace talks?
I think it's good that these efforts are ongoing, but I don't see them as being particularly significant in creating any kind of platform or path forward that could lead to serious talks about ending the conflict. We have the concept of spillover effects, where you have action taking one place can spill over into another, but frankly, the notion that prisoner exchanges could lead to the two parties in conflict sitting down, I think, is highly unlikely. The fact that the United States and Russia are negotiating also is problematic in the sense that Ukraine is not involved there. I mean, Ukraine is one of the main two participants in this conflict, and to be completely shut out by a patriarchal supporter like the United States does not lead to a pathway where Ukraine said, yes, I'll follow along with this. I mean, President Zelenskyy has taken a diplomatic posture on this and said, yes, I'm willing to talk with Russia, I'm willing to listen to the Americans, but ultimately, if there is not a way for Ukraine to directly communicate with Russia, to sit down across the table with them face to face, no matter where it's being sponsored in Istanbul or in other places, then these parallel efforts will not come to any conclusion that is satisfactory.
Yes, I want to talk a bit about Ankara's role in this process, this whole process. Gülru, how does Ankara manage the competing pressures of the US, Russia, and the European countries, and where is this balance heading to?
Well, I think that has been the biggest challenge for Turkey, frankly speaking, because we saw at times Turkey's role within NATO was questioned. There were sanctions, U.S. sanctions towards some of the Turkish companies and Turkish business people. At times, parties to the war made comments saying that Turkey is pro this country rather than, but we've really tried to be an honest broker from the very onset. The two foreign ministers of the warring parties came together at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum at the very, very beginning of the war. Then there was, again, as we've mentioned before, the Istanbul Process. Then there was the grain deal. Then again, the Istanbul Process last spring, and hopefully now we will revive these talks, and maybe there will be some concrete developments and concrete results. But it hasn't been easy for Turkey. Because while Europe completely stopped engaging with Russia, Turkey continued that dialogue. And it's because of that today Turkey can play a part, that Turkey can be an honest broker between the two sides and can mediate talks and can host these talks. But as I've said before, Turkey was very much criticized for continuing to engage with Russia, for continuing to have trade with Russia. But it is a matter of concern, I think, for Ankara that as the war continues, we know that the U.S. will tighten the screws on the sanctions and impose sanctions on third parties. And we saw from the readout of Minister Fidan's meeting with Secretary Rubio that there was an emphasis on, the that all NATO countries should stop buying oil from Russia, which meant that we expect Turkey to stop buying oil from Russia. So it won't be easy because Turkey has been heavily reliant on Russian energy from the 1980s. So we hope that the war will. I'm not very optimistic, but I don't want to be pessimistic at the same time. We hope that the war will end soon because as the war prolongs, it will be more difficult for Turkey to chart its course and its margin of maneuver will be highly constrained.
Yes, Gülru, Yahani, Sean, thank you all for joining me on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Zeynep Gökçe. If you've got any comments, please share them with us on X @StraightTalkTRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.